So I did that. So I got a $2,500 software.
My name is Jessica Lee, but I also go by JM Lee for my books. And the books that I've written are When October Ends and Chasing, and they're the first two books of my three-book series, Novus Proprius. The series, The Novus Proprius Chronicles, takes place after an environmental disaster where the world has been changed in a lot of ways by this great storm that happened. And so the people that are left on the earth, they've been kind of mutated and deformed into these strange creatures. And the main character, Zaina, is one of these creatures. And so there's also these little islands all over the world where these new creatures live. And the main character is a teenage werewolf named Zaina, and she starts experiencing these strange mood swings, and she starts getting stronger, and she doesn't quite know what's happening to her. And then on top of that, she starts, people start telling her that, you know, she's meant to fulfill this great prophecy where she's supposed to save the world again, but nobody will really tell her exactly what she's supposed to do because they don't want to mess up, you know, the future, because they've heard that in the future if they tell her too much, it'll mess things up. So the story is about Zaina, which the cover is supposed to be, you know, Zaina, half wolf, half human. And the story is about Zaina and her journey as she tries to, you know, save the world. But then there's these great big plot twists where, like in the second book, the government has created these things called felines, where it's basically a werewolf, but they turn into tigers instead. And so there's a lot of obstacles she has to overcome, there's a lot of things she has to figure out on her own, and then the third book, there's a huge reveal, and I can't say too much about that. The story I intentionally never intended to publish. I originally wrote it, you know, it was just one of those projects where I had an idea in my head, and I just wrote it down and never thought I would finish it. I wrote the diary entry that's in the beginning of the first book, and I just kind of put it away for a few months. I didn't really think too much about it because I had no idea what I was going to write. And then one day I found the diary entries and I thought, hey, you know, I could do something with this. And so all of a sudden the ideas just started flowing and I came up with all these crazy ideas. And then once the first book was completely written, which took me about a year, you know, we thought maybe we should just publish it, like turn it into little copies that we could give to my grandparents as like Christmas presents or something. But then my dad read it and he really loved it and thought that, you know, maybe we should actually publish it. And so we went through a little bit of the traditional process trying to publish it with a really big publisher, but most of the people just told us that they didn't have time because there were so many people submitting books. So we got impatient and decided to self-publish. Well, I think one of the biggest things that's the most fun about writing a book, or at least writing a series, is creating your own world with all the people, and, you know, because you give everybody a backstory and you bring all your characters to life, at least, you know, in your head until it's actually published. And I think the most fun that I've had with my series is just, you know, creating the characters, because I've always loved like making things up, I guess, if that makes sense. But creating the characters is usually what I find the most fun. But I think one of the biggest difficulties is, you know, at least with the third book, one of the main challenges that I've had is trying to get to the end of it, because there's so many questions that I've created in the first two books, and I have to answer all of them in the third book. And, you know, I worked for 3 years on one chapter because I just couldn't get past that one point to get to, you know, the next point where I knew where I would go from there. So there's been a lot of difficulties that I've had with just trying to answer all the questions and getting past the parts of the book where I wasn't quite sure how I would get to the ending. And so that's, you know, writer's block is definitely the biggest challenge. We originally never intended to publish it, but once we kind of realized that there was, that the story was pretty good and could really go somewhere, we decided that we wanted to publish it. And after the publishers, the big publishing companies that we sent it to, didn't really have time to read over it and we just got impatient waiting, we decided to self-publish. So we had my wonderful grandmother as my editor, and she, you know, sent us a lot of good things. And after we kind of went through the editing and had a lot of family read over it and tell us that, you know, it was a pretty good story, which I didn't think at the time because I was just 13 and I had no intention of becoming an author. We sent the book off to A&A Printing in Florida, and they sent us copies. And one of the biggest hiccups we had at the beginning was we accidentally, we didn't read over the proof copy that they sent us, and so we ended up with 200 copies of messed up books where there was 4 pages that were completely out of order. So there was like, the one page was from page 243 or something, but it was on page 2. And we had 4 pages like that where they were just completely out of order, and because we didn't really read the proof copy, we didn't realize that, so we got 200 copies that were messed up. So that was one of the biggest challenges that we had with the self-publishing. But once we fixed it and we got that settled, we got 200 fixed copies that were in the right order, and then we started going to steampunk events. We started, having book signings and things. One of my first events was in Richmond, and they didn't realize that my name was J. Emily, just a J and an M, so they put Jim Lee because they thought it was a typo. So we've had a few hiccups here and there, but so far it's been pretty fun. At the conventions and things that we go to, a lot of times people have 2 very different reactions. There's one reaction where they're like, wow, this is amazing, I want to help support a teen author, or they just want to talk to me and figure out why I started writing. And then there's the other side where people kind of say, well, you're 13, your book must not be any good. So I've had, one of the biggest things that I've had to deal with was many people telling me that because I'm a 13-year-old, my book must not be any good. But then there's also ones that read it and they think, wow, this is pretty impressive for a 13-year-old. My peers at school have taken it pretty well, and I've had a lot of support from friends and family, especially my family. They were probably the biggest buyers at the beginning. And so I've had a lot of mixed reactions from my books. Well, I had a gentleman tell me that he didn't want to read my book because the main character was a female and that he didn't read books where the hero was a female. I also had another gentleman tell me that he didn't want to read my book because evolution doesn't happen in the short amount of time in my book, and I tried to explain to him that it was mutation and not evolution, but he would not believe me. He just would not read it. I don't understand. In the future, I do have plans for many other books. After I finish the 3-book series, which I'm hoping to finish this summer because I've been working on the 3rd book for about 4 years now, and I blame it on high school. So once I finish that book, I plan on writing a steampunk novel called Blood and Tears, and that's, it should be steampunk mixed with fantasy and kind of alternate history because it involves Queen Boudica's angry spirit coming back from coming to London in 1865. So that should be interesting. I also have plans for, like a ghost story that I've been planning on writing since I was 12, and when I was 13 I always wanted to write a book about horses, so maybe that'll happen one day. I have a lot of plans for books, and if I could be a full-time author and have that just be my job, that would be great. But they always say not to quit your day job when you become an author, so we'll see what happens. Well, one of the biggest inspirations, if that's what we want to call it, is my father constantly hounding me to finish my books and to make sure that I become a millionaire so he doesn't have to pay for college. So I would say that that's probably one of the main things that's pushing me to become an author. But I also enjoy making my own worlds. Like I mentioned earlier with my characters, I've always loved making worlds up, and especially with the steampunk novel I'm planning, because there was so much planning that went into creating these characters and all the background stories, because one of the characters is actually from India, and so there was a lot of research that was involved into India during the 1800s and all the really rich culture that they have. And so one of the main inspirations that I just love is creating worlds and creating the people. But one of the things that got me started was actually a teacher in 5th grade, I believe, and she would have us write short stories. And the first couple short stories I wrote were absolutely terrible. I had one about a ghost in McDonald's, and my teacher was like, well, it's interesting, but you may have to revise it a little. So, I mean, my first few short stories, I was in 5th grade, so they weren't very good to begin with, and then the ideas were completely, they were completely absurd, but my teacher inspired me to keep writing, and so like when October Ends was at the beginning, I started a lot of stories that I never finished, but finally it came down to one story that I was willing to finish and that I had ideas for, and it was pretty cool.
Well, it was her idea. The one on the left you don't see that well because it's actually
Could get this turned to a caramel.
caramel. paper?
Primal Paper Comics. Like they do like a bunch of superhero stuff, but they're like based in Norfolk. So like all of
So she's in the process of converting this into kind of like a manga book.
nice.
We'll see how that turns. It's kind of an experiment.
See how it goes. Yeah.